The wind blew dry and sharp across the plains as Eli McCall trudged down the dirt road. His boots caked in dust and his soul heavier than the gear he carried. He hadn't spoken to another soul in 3 days, not since he left the ghost of his ranch behind, its barren soil no longer fit to feed man or beast. The drought had taken everything, his cattle, his land, and finally his will to keep fighting. All he wanted now was a warm meal, a roof over his head for the night, and maybe a place to lay low until he figured out what came next. It was late afternoon when he saw it, a small, tucked-away town nestled between 2 rolling hills, like it was hiding from the world. The sign read Whitlow's End, and Eli muttered under his breath, "Fitting name." He hadn't meant to find the place. It wasn't on any route he recognized, but he was too tired to care. His legs were aching, and the sun felt like it was peeling the skin from his neck. The town was quiet, almost too quiet. A few storefronts sat half-closed, their wooden signs faded by time and sun. The blacksmith gave him a brief nod, but said nothing. The saloon was boarded up. There was no sheriff's office he could see, no general store with chatter out front. It felt more like a memory of a town than a living one. Eli found himself on the steps of a modest whitewashed church at the edge of town. He leaned against the railing, breathing in the scent of wood and dried sagebrush. He considered knocking on the church door, but before he could raise his hand, a voice startled him from behind. "You look like hell." Eli turned to see a woman in her 30s, thin, sharp-eyed, with auburn hair pinned back beneath a dusty bonnet. She carried a small sack of flour and wore an apron stained from a day's work. She had a tired kindness to her, like someone who'd long accepted life's hardships. "Been on the trail a while," Eli admitted, tipping his hat. "Name's Eli McCall. Just passing through." She looked him over, eyes lingering on his worn boots and hollow cheeks. "Name's Clara Ridge. You hungry?" Eli hesitated. He wasn't the kind to take handouts, but his stomach didn't share his pride. "Reckon I could eat, if it ain't too much trouble." Clara smiled just a little. "My friend and I could use help around our place. Chores, mostly. You lend a hand, we'll feed you. Maybe even give you a bed if you're not the kind to steal chickens or scare children." "I don't steal," he said, straightening. "Good, follow me." Her property was a mile outside town, to modest cabins on a stretch of land that had seen better days. The fences were in need of mending, and the garden looked half-forgotten. Another woman stood on the porch when they arrived. She was tall, with hard features and a long braid of black hair that fell over one shoulder. "This one didn't smile, Mabel," Clara said. "This is Eli. He's gonna help out in exchange for supper and a roof." Mabel's arms were crossed. "You sure? He's got calluses and manners. I think we'll be fine." Eli glanced between them. "I don't mean to impose, just need rest. Maybe a few days' work, then I'll move on." Mabel gave a slow nod. "Fine, but don't get too comfortable." That night, Eli sat at a long wooden table as Clara dished out rabbit stew and cornbread. 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, all under 10, sat quietly, barely looking at him. One boy fiddled nervously with a spoon. The girl wouldn't speak. Mabel didn't eat with them. After dinner, Clara showed him to a small side room attached to the barn. It had a cot, a lantern, and a quilt that smelled of cedar. "It ain't much," she said, "but it's dry, and it's yours while you're with us." Eli gave her a grateful nod. "This is more than I expected." Clara hesitated at the door. "We don't get many strangers out here. Folks like to keep to themselves. Just don't go wandering too much at night." "Coyotes?" he asked. She gave a small, unreadable smile. "Something like that." Then she was gone, alone. Eli stretched out on the cot and listened to the wind whistle through the cracks in the barn. Walsey, he was thankful. A meal, a roof, a break. But as he drifted toward sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling he was being watched. He told himself it was just the silence of an unfamiliar place. But the truth was, Whitlow's End didn't just feel forgotten. It felt hungry. And he had just walked straight into its jaws. Morning came early. Eli McCall rose before the sun, the scent of livestock and old hay in his lungs, and the creak of the barn's rafters his alarm. After weeks on the move, the stillness here was almost too quiet. As he stepped out into the morning haze, a low fog clung to the grass, and the sky stretched wide and colorless above him. Clara greeted him with a tin cup of coffee and a short list of chores: fix the broken gate on the west fence, muck out the stables, and help haul firewood from the shed to the house. It wasn't anything he hadn't done before, and the rhythm of labor gave him something solid to hold onto. As he worked, the children watched him from a distance. The little boy, Timmy, peeked around the chicken coop, wide-eyed and silent. The girl, Seti, sat on the porch swing, hugging a ragged doll. The third, the oldest boy named Ben, helped him briefly with the firewood but barely spoke. It was the kind of quiet that wasn't just shyness, it was worn into them. Like silence had been taught. At lunch, Clara offered cold biscuits and smoked pork. Mabel showed up then, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She didn't join them at the table, just stood by the door as if guarding it. "You keep to yourself?" she asked Eli suddenly. "I do," he replied, brushing crumbs from his hands. "You got no people?" He met her eyes. "Not anymore." Mabel grunted. "That's good." The way she said it gave Eli pause. There was no sympathy in her tone, just cold approval, as if being alone made him easier to handle. That afternoon, Clara asked him to fetch something from the root cellar, but when he reached the trapdoor in the kitchen floor, she suddenly stepped in front of it, blocking his way. "I'll get it," she said, too quickly. Eli stepped back. "Didn't mean to overstep." She smiled thin and tight. "It's just easier if I do it. Things are disorganized down there." From the way her voice shifted, Eli could tell she didn't want him near that door. And for the first time since arriving, he felt the warm welcome beginning to peel away. Later that day, while trimming fence posts, Eli spotted something in the tall grass behind the chicken coop, a weather-beaten man's hat, half buried in the dirt. He picked it up and brushed it off. Faded letters inside read, CP, initials he didn't recognize. But the hat didn't belong to anyone here. He hadn't seen it on the boys or either woman. When he mentioned it to Mabel, she simply said, "Trash, blows in from the hills sometimes," and took the hat from him too fast, too forcefully. That evening, as he sat by the fire with a cup of tea, he noticed Clara whispering with Mabel in the kitchen. They spoke in hushed tones, glancing his way. More than once, the children had gone to bed. He could make out only a few words. "Not yet, we need him, Abel, and you promised." He pretended not to notice, but his nerves were alert now, coiled tight. As night fell, Eli took a walk to the far edge of the property, under the pretense of checking the fence line. The moon lit the prairie with a ghostly glow. In the distance, he saw a small wooden cross sticking out of the earth near the tree line. No marker, no flowers, just a grave, quiet and forgotten. He stared at it for a long time. When he returned to the cabin, the porch light was out. Clara had left a lantern for him beside the barn door, but the flame had already burned low. He picked it up and pushed the door open quietly. Inside, everything seemed unchanged, but his saddlebag, which he always kept under the cot, had been moved. He could tell by the way the blanket draped differently over it. Someone had searched through his things. Eli didn't sleep much that night. He kept one boot on and his knife under his pillow. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt like something holding its breath, watching. He'd come to Whitlow's End for rest, but now every creak in the floorboards felt like a warning. Every look from Clara and Mabel felt like a calculation. The children's silence wasn't natural, it was trained. And the strangest part, they'd taken him in too easily, too quickly, like they'd been waiting for him. Eli McCall had been around long enough to know when something didn't sit right. The longer he stayed with Clara and Mabel, the more unsettled he became. The chores were steady and fair, nothing more than a man might expect in exchange for a roof and meals, but it was the way the women acted that turned his gut. Clara, with her warm smiles and soft eyes, was growing a little too friendly. She lingered when she brought his meals. Her compliments grew more personal. "Strong shoulders for a man who's been sleeping on hard ground," she'd say. Or, "You clean up nicer than I thought you would." At first, Eli brushed it off. She was lonely, he figured. Everyone in Whitlow's End seemed to carry a shadow. But Mabel was another matter altogether. Mabel didn't flirt. She didn't even smile. If Clara's kindness felt like a lure, Mabel's gaze felt like a blade. She watched him constantly when he chopped wood, when he fed the chickens, when he helped Timmy haul water from the well. She always found something to criticize. "You stack like you've never split a log before. Don't bother teaching the boy. He won't be here long." Every time she spoke, Eli felt the temperature drop. One evening after supper, Clara invited him to sit on the porch. The air was thick with the smell of chamomile and sage, and the sunset cast golden fire across the hills. She brought him a drink, a little too sweet, and leaned in close enough that he could smell the lavender oil in her hair. "You could stay, you know," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "There's always work to do here. Boys need a man around. I could use the company." Eli turned to face her. "You barely know me." "I know enough." She tucked a curl behind her ear. "I know you're strong, quiet, not a troublemaker. That's rare around here. He took a slow sip from the glass. Something about the way she said that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. I don't aim to stay long, he said carefully. Just until I'm back on my feet. Her smile didn't waver, but her eyes grew distant. That's what the last one said. What last one? She stood. Never mind. That night, Eli couldn't sleep. The cot felt colder. He lay awake staring at the rafters. Every sound outside the barn now sharper, an owl hoot, a rustling in the grass, the creak of a shutter, and something else, footsteps, light, careful, circling the barn. He slipped quietly from bed and pressed himself to the wall beside the door, his knife gripped tight in his hand. But the footsteps faded away. No knock, no voices, just silence again. The next morning, he checked his saddlebag. His revolver was missing. When he asked Clara about it, she raised a brow. A gun? You didn't mention one before. I always carry one, for coyotes, or worse. Mabel, sitting at the table shelling peas, didn't even look up. Don't need guns in Whitlow's End. We keep peace our own way. Later that afternoon, Eli walked into town. He needed to clear his head and ask a few questions. The trading post was still open. Barely. An old man named Vince ran it, a toothpick always hanging from his lip and a cane leaning against the counter. He gave Eli a nod, but little more. You been around here long? Eli asked. Too long. Vince muttered. Why? You know Clara Ridge and Mabel. Vince's face twitched at the names. Yeah, I know 'em. They run a place out past the creek. I've been staying there. Vince looked him over. You might not want to. Eli leaned in. Why's that? The old man tapped the counter with his knuckle. Couple years back, some travelers passed through. Young man. Said he was heading to Utah. Stayed with them women. Then he was gone. Heard he left in the middle of the night. Without his things. Without his horse. Eli narrowed his eyes. And 2 weeks later, one of Clara's boys had a new coat that looked a whole lot like that fella's. People said nothing, didn't ask. Whitlow's End don't poke at ghosts, son. Especially not the kind that wear aprons and smile too wide. Eli left the store feeling colder than the wind biting at his neck. The stories weren't proof, but they were enough to turn suspicion into fear. That night, as he lay on the cot, he kept one eye open and the knife within reach. He had come for rest, but something told him he'd found a trap instead, and the bait was kindness. Eli McCall hadn't been a praying man in years, but by the time the sun rose the next morning, he whispered a few words beneath his breath. He wasn't sure if they were for himself or for the next man who might follow in his footsteps. Something was wrong out here. He could feel it in his bones. After what the old man at the trading post told him, Eli had spent half the night lying awake, listening for footsteps, listening for voices, listening for the sound of a lock turning. But the night passed, quiet to quiet. When dawn came, he went about the morning chores with care, pretending nothing had changed, but everything had. It was just after breakfast when Eli saw it half buried in the tall grass near the barn, not far from where he found the hat days earlier. A strip of leather poked up from the dirt, like a tongue sticking out of a grave. Curious, he crouched down and tugged. A belt came free, worn and weathered, with the initials GR etched into the buckle. Not his. Not anyone he'd seen in Whitlow's End, and not the first personal item to turn up where it shouldn't. His gut clenched. He slipped the belt beneath his coat and took it into the barn, stashing it in a hayloft before Mabel came outside to check on him. She stood in the barn door, arms folded, her usual hard stare pinned to him like a needle. You're slow this morning, she said. Didn't sleep much. Coyotes were howling. Mabel said nothing, but he saw something flicker across her face, barely a change, but enough to know she didn't believe a word of it later. Clara came to him with a basket of laundry and a request. The well's near. Dry again. Could you go fetch water from the spring? Take the wagon. It's a ways out. Eli nodded. Course. She smiled, but something about it felt strained, like a lie to practiced. She handed him a map drawn on an old envelope. The route wasn't hard, but she kept pointing out unnecessary turns. He realized then, they were testing him. Testing if he'd come back. Eli hitched up the wagon and took the trail past the fields, heading southeast toward the spring. Once out of sight, he stopped the wagon and climbed into the bed. He unlatched the floorboards and peered beneath them, searching if other men had passed through here and vanished. There might be proof, anything that didn't belong to the women or the children. He found it. Folded beneath a burlap sack was a small leather-bound journal. The initials on the front matched the belt. GR. Eli flipped it open. The entries were dated a year prior. A man named Gideon Ross traveling west toward Colorado. Notes about Whitlow's End, meeting two widows, helping out for a few days, then nothing. The last entry was just a single line. I think they know I'm suspicious. When Eli returned with the water, Clara met him with a smile and an extra helping of pie at supper. You always come back, she said sweetly. That's rare. Eli forced a nod. Figure it's the least I can do. Across the table, Mabel's fork scraped against her plate like a warning. The children were quiet again. Timmy had a bruise near his temple that hadn't been there yesterday. Sadie kept glancing at the cellar door, and that was when Eli knew whatever had happened to Gideon Ross, it hadn't happened all at once. These women weren't reckless, they were patient. After dinner, he asked Clara about the belt he'd found in the barn. Her face didn't flinch. Must have been from one of the hired men we had years ago. We take in travelers sometimes. You're not the first. Where do they go? He asked evenly. They leave, when they're ready, and leave their belongings behind, she smiled too calmly. Men don't always plan well. Mabel stood abruptly and carried her plate to the basin, her back stiff. That night, as Eli lay in his cot, he stared at the ceiling, his thoughts racing. Gideon Ross had written about suspicion. So did Eli. He now had a journal, a belt, and a memory of a man's hat. The pieces were adding up fast, and he knew two things for certain. Asterisk asterisk 1 asterisk asterisk he was not the first man these women had taken in. Asterisk asterisk 2 asterisk asterisk they didn't plan on letting him walk out alive. The cellar door had been whispering to Eli for days. It wasn't just the way Clara rushed to block him from opening it, or how Mabel shot sideways glances at it every time the children got too close. It was the weight of it, like the wood itself was heavy with secrets, and now, with proof stacking up, the initials carved into the belt buckle, the journal hidden in the wagon, the missing revolver. Eli knew whatever was down there might be the key to everything. He just had to find a way in. The opportunity came that night after dinner, when Clara slipped into the bathhouse behind the cabin and Mabel busied herself with the livestock. Eli crept into the kitchen, heart pounding against his ribs. The cellar trapdoor was a simple plank with an iron ring to lift it, but it was locked-latched from the inside and secured with a sturdy old padlock. He hadn't seen a key hanging anywhere obvious, which meant it had to be on one of them. His gut told him it would be Clara. She was the one who masked things with warmth. She smiled too easily. She made you forget to ask questions. People like Mabel were straightforward. They used fear like a stick, but Clara used kindness like a net. He waited until the house was quiet again. Clara's bedroom door was ajar, candlelight flickering behind it. Eli moved carefully, every floorboard threatening to give him away. He paused outside her door, listening, soft humming, the sound of a brush dragging through hair. She was alone. He pushed the door gently, just enough to peek in. Clara stood at her vanity, back turned. Her hair was down, and her apron was draped over the chair. And there, glinting on the apron string, was the key. Ellie's breath caught. He crept in slowly, each step deliberate. Her reflection in the mirror showed nothing she hadn't seen him. When he was close enough, he slipped the key off the apron string and backed out of the room without a sound. Seconds later, he was in the kitchen. The key slid into the padlock and clicked open with a reluctant snap. The trapdoor creaked as he lifted it. A heavy draft of cold, damp air rushed upward. The scent was sharp earth, mildew, and something metallic beneath it all. Blood. He climbed down carefully, lantern in hand, and closed the door behind him. The cellar was deeper than he expected. Narrow stone walls, packed dirt floors. The lantern flickered, casting long shadows across crates and shelves. At first, it looked like any other root cellar: jars of preserved fruit, bags of grain, an old plow blade. But then Eli noticed the far end, where the stone wall was incomplete, exposing a hollowed-out space that had clearly been carved recently. A room. No, a holding cell. There were iron shackles bolted into the wall, a rusted tin plate, scraps of cloth, rope, chains, and blood stains, not fresh, but undeniable. Ellie's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a hiding place. It was a prison. Beside the wall, half buried under a blanket, he found a ledger. It was wrapped in oilcloth, and the cover was worn soft from handling. He flipped it open. Inside, page after page bore names, rough descriptions, and dates. Gideon Ross, dark hair, 5 feet 10, passin' through, useful with animals. Daniel F. limped, had family east, talked too much. Eli McCall, strong hands, quiet, no ties, ideal. His name, already written, dated the day he arrived. His fingers trembled as he stared down at the page. They had planned this, all of it. The offer of food, Shelter, the sudden friendliness. Mabel's hostility was part of it. Make him feel off balance, keep him compliant. The ledger meant it. Had been done before, dozens of times. And if he didn't act soon, he'd be next. He tucked the ledger into his coat, turned to climb the stairs and froze. The trapdoor above was open. Clara stood at the top. The lantern light behind her framed her in shadow, but her voice was quiet, almost mournful. You weren't supposed to find that yet. Ellie's hand dropped to his knife, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. You keep records? He asked. Why? Clara sighed. Mabel insists on it. She says if you're going to do something hard, you ought to be honest about it. Honest? Eli growled. You chain men in the dirt. You bleed them dry. Clara looked down at him, her face unreadable. Only the ones no one will miss. She closed the trapdoor. And locked it. Eli stood there in the darkness, the sound of the lock echoing above him. But he didn't panic. He had the ledger. He had the truth. And now, he had something they didn't expect, a reason to fight. The lock clinked shut above him, and Eli McCall stood in the darkness, breathing slow and steady. He didn't call out, didn't waste breath on threats. He just waited, counting the seconds, by the tick of his own heartbeat, listening to the faint creaks of the house settling above. He still had the lantern, still had his knife, and most importantly, the ledger was now tucked inside his coat. Proof. If he could survive long enough to get it out of here, he could bring an end to this trap they'd built from sweet smiles and slow poison. After 10 minutes, he began to move. He examined the shackles on the cellar wall, thick iron rings driven deep into stone, rusted but strong. Whoever had last been chained here had struggled. The scratches on the floor proved it. That wouldn't be him. He turned back toward the stairwell and tested the underside of the trapdoor. Solid, reinforced with steel brackets. He couldn't bust it open without tools. Then he scanned the walls and found a rotting rake handle, propped in the corner. It wasn't much, but maybe enough to pry the hinges if he worked them carefully. He set to it upstairs. Clara stood by the window, wringing her hands. Mabel lit a kerosene lamp without speaking. You shouldn't have locked him in, Clara said, quietly. He found the book. What did you expect me to do? Let him sit and stew with it? Mabel snapped. He was going to run. I saw it in his eyes yesterday. He wouldn't have run. He's not like the others. He helps. Her voice trailed off. Mabel gave her a hard look. Don't you dare say you're getting soft again. Clara said nothing. She stared out into the darkness, whispering more to herself than to Mabel. I was just so tired of burying them. Back in the cellar, the rake handle cracked on the third hinge. Eli swore under his breath and braced it again, this time wedging the handle into the side groove and pulling harder. Wood splintered. One bracket popped loose. He climbed the steps and tried pushing again, this time with all his weight. The trapdoor groaned and opened just a crack. It was enough. He slid a boot between the gap and wedged it further. A final heave, and the door slammed upward with a thud. He pulled himself out just in time to hear the front door creak open. Timmy, the little boy, stared at him, eyes wide. Go back to your room, Eli said gently. I heard Mama locking you in, the boy whispered. She says it's for your own good. Eli crouched beside him. Your mama's wrong. What she's doing is hurting people, and if I don't leave, they'll hurt me too. Timmy looked torn, blinking fast. You're the first one that fixed the fence. Eli smiled faintly. Then I need to fix something bigger now. He handed the boy a folded paper from the ledger. If I don't come back, take this to the old man at the trading post. Tell him Eli sent you. He'll know. The boy nodded solemnly and vanished down the hall. Eli moved fast, slipping outside into the cold night. His saddlebag was gone, but he didn't care. He had the ledger and the journal, and he was still alive. He cut across the yard toward the horse pen, only to stop dead. Mabel stood at the gate, rifle in hand. You're not going anywhere. Behind her, one of the mares neighed nervously, sensing the tension. I've got names, Eli said. Dates, records. If I make it to town, they'll know, which is exactly why you won't. Mabel raised the rifle. Eli didn't hesitate. He dove behind the trough as the shot rang out, splinters flying. He rolled, pulled his knife, and threw it in one motion. It struck her in the shoulder. Mabel screamed and fell backward, the rifle clattering against the post. Eli ran from the porch. Clara appeared wild-eyed, barefoot, carrying a lantern. She saw Mabel on the ground, Eli running past the gate, and for a moment, just a blink, he thought she might yell for help. But she didn't. She stepped in front of Mabel's fallen body and shouted into the dark, Go, Eli, before she gets up again. Eli stopped in shock. Clara's voice trembled. I never wanted it to be like this. I just wanted a place where no one left us, where we were safe. You buried them, Clara. You locked them in a cellar." She nodded slowly. "And I'll carry that to hell." Eli ran into the night. Behind him, the lantern light flickered and faded. Ahead, Whitlow's End slept under a sky full of stars. He didn't know how far he'd make it, but for the first time in weeks, he felt something. More than suspicion. He felt purpose. He wasn't just surviving now, he was bringing justice. Eli McCall rode hard through the night. He didn't stop to rest. He didn't stop to think. The pain in his ribs, the burning in his legs, none of it mattered. All that mattered was putting distance between himself and Whitlow's End and getting the ledger into the right hands, because what he carried wasn't just evidence, it was a death list. His name had been on it, and he'd be damned if anyone else's ever would be again. By mid-morning, he reached the edge of the next town, Hollister's Gap, a modest settlement where the buildings leaned but still stood tall. People here had the kind of look Eli trusted, sunburned, cautious, hard-earned decency. He stabled a borrowed horse and went straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Albie Kane was a thick-set man with gray in his beard and skepticism in his eyes. He didn't look up from his paperwork as Eli entered. "Whatever it is, if it didn't bleed, it can wait." "It bled," Eli said, dropping the ledger on the desk. Kane looked up. "Start talking." "It took an hour." Eli told everything about Clara, Mabel, the cellar, the missing men, the trapdoor that led to a grave no one could see from the porch. He showed the ledger, the journal, the belt. He even told Kane about the boy Timmy and the others who had learned to live in silence because they'd been taught that asking questions meant punishment. Kane didn't speak for a long time. When Eli finished, he just sat there, thumbing through the ledger page by page. "Gideon Ross," the sheriff murmured. "I remember that name. He had a brother send out wires looking for him. We figured he got lost in the canyons." "He didn't," Eli said, flatly. "No," Kane agreed. "He didn't." Within the hour, Kane had deputized 2 men, loaded up rifles, and mounted 3 horses. "You coming back with us?" the sheriff asked. Eli nodded. "I've got unfinished business." Meanwhile, back at Whitlow's End, Mabel lay in bed, her shoulder bound in gauze, her jaw clenched with pain and fury. "I told you," she hissed at Clara. "I told you to end it when we had the chance." Clara stood by the window, arms wrapped around herself, looking out at the horizon where Eli had vanished hours before. "He didn't have to die," Mabel snarled. "They all have to die. That's the deal. That's how we keep this place." Clara turned slowly. "There's no deal. There's just you, me, and all the lies we've told ourselves so we can sleep at night." Mabel tried to sit up. "If he brings the law, he already has." They both fell silent as hoofbeats echoed faintly in the distance. By the time Sheriff Kane and his men reached the Ridge farmstead, Clara was already on the porch with the children, hands raised in surrender. Mabel was nowhere in sight. The children stood stiff and quiet, their eyes wide, their faces unreadable. "We're not here to hurt the young ones," Kane called. "We just want the truth and justice." Clara nodded once. "Then you'll find it behind the barn. She's waiting with a shotgun." The standoff didn't last long. Mabel tried to run, wounded and desperate, but Eli cut her off at the ridge trail. She raised the gun, but this time, he didn't hesitate. One shot rang out. Mabel collapsed in the dust, the rifle falling useless beside her. When Eli approached, she was still alive, but barely. Her voice was wet with blood. "You don't know what we've been through," she choked. "I know what you've done," Eli said coldly. "And you think they'll forgive you for it?" she rasped, eyes darting to the children on the porch. "You think they'll forget?" He stared down at her, expression unreadable. "They don't have to forget, but they deserve to survive it." Kane's men searched the property, uncovering hidden graves, burnt belongings, and the remains of men who had gone missing over the past 4 years. Clara gave a full confession. She claimed she never touched the killings, never agreed to them, but she'd stayed. She'd lied. She'd helped cover them up. And the law didn't care much for half-measures. In the end, Mabel died from the gunshot before they could hang her. Clara stood trial and was sentenced to 20 years for her role in the crimes. Her children, Sadie, Timmy, and Ben, were taken into protective custody. But something strange happened there. Timmy refused to speak to anyone but Eli. "I want to stay with you," the boy said, gripping Ellie's sleeve. "You're the only one who didn't lie." Eli looked at Kane, then back at the child. "I ain't much of a father. You don't have to be," Timmy said. "Just don't leave." Ellie's voice cracked. "All right then, I won't." Weeks passed. The Ridge property was sold off. The cellar was sealed. The graves were marked properly, and Eli McCall, once a worn-out drifter, now had a reason to stay put. He built a small home just outside Hollister's Gap, simple, clean, with room for one boy who liked to talk too much and chase chickens in the yard. He didn't forget the darkness he'd walked through, but for the first time in years, he'd walked out of it alive. The cabin felt different after the arrests. Gone were the quiet schemes behind every smile, the subtle looks between Clara and Mabel, the tension that had clung to the air like smoke. But Eli knew the damage wasn't gone. It still lived in the eyes of the children. Sadie, the oldest, had stopped speaking altogether. She sat by the fireplace most days with her doll clutched tight, lips pressed together like a gate welded shut. Ben, who had once shadowed Eli round the yard, now refused to look anyone in the eye. And Timmy, bright, curious, too small to understand everything, kept asking questions no one wanted to answer. Why's Mama not coming back? Is Mabel in heaven now? Are we bad too? Eli didn't have answers for any of it, but he knew what not to do. Lie. After the trial, the judge ruled the children would be taken into the state's custody, split up, most likely, and sent to foster homes across the territory. Eli sat in the back of the courthouse with his jaw clenched, Timmy asleep on his lap. He didn't speak up, not yet, but the thought of these three already shaken, already lost, being torn from the only family they had left, it sat wrong in his gut. A few days later, he rode out to the Ridge place one last time. It had been turned over to the county, the livestock sold off, the farmhouse stripped bare, but the place still had ghosts. As he walked the property, he could almost hear Mabel shouting from the barn, Clara humming in the kitchen, the quiet tap of little feet running between the rooms. Eli stepped inside the old root cellar one more time, lantern held high. The walls were still stained, the shackles still there, untouched, but now, the place felt hollow. The dread was gone, replaced by silence. He climbed back out and closed the door behind him for the last time. As he turned to leave, a small voice called out behind him, "You came back." It was Sadie. She stood at the edge of the field, barefoot, her hair tangled from the wind, her doll dangled in one hand. Eli nodded. "Didn't think anyone would be here. I sneak away sometimes," she said softly. "Feels quieter here, even with the bad things." He walked to her slowly. "You all right?" She shrugged. "I don't know. Mama said to always smile, even if I was scared, so I did. But now my mouth hurts." Eli crouched beside her, resting his hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to smile for me, not unless you want to." She didn't smile, but her shoulders relaxed. That night, Eli sat on the porch outside the small shack he now called home, watching the sun dip behind the hills. Sheriff Kane stopped by, a letter in hand. "Got word from the Capitol. They're sending a train to take the kids next week." Eli didn't speak. "You gonna say goodbye?" Eli sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm thinking about something worse than goodbye." Kane raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" Keeping em. Kane chuckled. You can barely keep a tomato plant alive." "I know," Eli said, "but I can give them something they ain't had in years." "What's that?" "Truth. Safety to chance." Kane handed him the letter and gave a slow nod. "You'll need papers. And patience." "Got more of one than the other," Eli replied, "but I'll manage." Eli spent the next days gathering what little he had: food, blankets, a second cot. He moved the children into his home before the train ever came. No one in Hollister's Gap raised a fuss. Folks there had seen enough heartbreak to know when someone was trying to stop it. Sadie eventually started speaking again, only to Eli. At first, she asked questions late at night, when the oil lamp burned low. "Why did Mama lie? Are bad people always evil? Can I be good, even if I wasn't brave?" Eli always answered honestly, "Even when it hurt, you can be good, even if you're scared, especially if you're scared. That's what makes it mean something." One night, Timmy came to Eli, dragging his small boots across the floor. "Did you ever kill anyone?" he asked quietly. Eli took a deep breath. "Yeah, I have." "Were they bad?" Eli looked out the window, where the stars blinked like far away promises. "Some were, some I don't know. But I try real hard to make sure I never become the kind of man they'd be scared of." Timmy nodded and leaned against his leg. "I'm glad you didn't kill Mabel when she was alive." Eli flinched. "Why's that?" "Because if you had, I think we would have turned into her." There was wisdom in that boy, a depth too heavy for someone his age. But that's what growing up in a house built on lies will do. It forces you to carry truth like a burden you never asked for. Eli didn't want these children to carry it alone, so he didn't. Eli McCall had always believed evil rode in loud, guns drawn, boots heavy, voices raised. But the evil that visited him now arrived on a quiet spring morning, in the form of a man wearing polished boots, a clean hat, and a silver tie pin shaped like a bird. He dismounted without dust on his coat, too clean for the trail, too careful with his words. "Mr. McCall," the man asked, tipping his hat. "That's me," Eli said from the porch, a whittling knife in his hand and a half-carved piece of cedar in his lap. The children were inside. Timmy was learning to write his name. Sadie was helping Ben sound out words from a tattered reader. The stranger's eyes flicked toward the door. He smiled. "Government sent me. Name's Langford. I'm with the Department of Domestic Welfare and Property Reclamation." Eli narrowed his eyes. "That a real department, only on paper," Langford said, stepping closer. "But I'm real, and I've come about those Ridge children." Langford didn't waste time. Inside, with coffee on the table and the children out back gathering eggs, he laid it out clean. "There's concern about precedent, about how you came into custody of these three." "They had no one," Eli said. "Their ma's in prison. Their aunt's dead. The county signed off on the guardianship." Langford nodded. "The local papers love you, Mr. McCall. Man rescues children from murder plot. Takes them in, gives Emma second chance. Makes a fine story." Eli said nothing. But not everyone likes stories that end clean, especially when there's federal property involved. Eli blinked. "What the hell are you talking about?" Langford leaned forward, voice calm. "That farm, those girls, Mabel and Clara. Do you think they built all that on their own? Someone funded it. Someone provided supplies, not out of kindness, out of interest." Ellie's stomach turned. Interest in what? In controlling people like them. Women with records. Children born into isolation. Drifters who wouldn't be missed. Langford's eyes gleamed. "It was an experiment, and you broke it." Eli stood slowly, his voice low and dangerous. "You're telling me the government backed what happened on that land?" Langford didn't flinch. "Not officially, but men in power like to study how people behave in extreme settings. Clara and Mabel didn't start out killers, but given time, given the right pressure, you turned them into monsters." Langford smiled faintly. "We revealed what was already there, and now, with your interference, there's a leak." He reached into his coat and pulled out a letter. "This is a federal order. The children are to be taken into protective custody pending further psychological evaluation." Eli didn't take the letter. He didn't even look at it. "What happens to them?" Langford shrugged. "Best case, foster care, separation, tracking, monitoring. Worst case." He tapped the paper. "Wardship, permanent, no names, no records." Eli stared at him, hatred building behind his eyes like a storm. Langford stood. "You're a good man, Mr. McCall. You did what you thought was right. But this is bigger than you now, bigger than the town, bigger than justice." He started for the door, but Eli stepped in his path. "You walk out that door with papers or not," Eli said. "You leave without those kids." Langford tilted his head. "Or what?" Ellie's voice was ice. "Or I bury the truth so deep, no one will find it. Same as they did before I came." Langford paused. He looked Eli up and down. Then, without a word, he slid the letter back into his coat. "Have it your way," he said, stepping off the porch. "But if you ever leave this land, they'll be waiting, and next time they won't knock." Eli watched him ride off, dust curling behind the horse like smoke from a fire that never went out. That night, after the children were asleep, Eli took the ledger and the journal, the last surviving evidence of the Ridge women's crimes, and buried them deep beneath the oak tree out back. Then he sat by the fire for a long time, rifle across his lap, gaze fixed on the dark horizon. The monsters were gone, but the men who made them, still out there. And now Eli McCall had a new kind of mission. Not just survival, not just healing, but protecting the truth from the people who feared it, and protecting three children who had already survived more darkness than most men ever would. It had been 6 months since the cabin filled with fear and shadows. 6 months since Mabel bled out behind the barn, since Clara was led away in chains, since 3 scared children were placed under the roof of a man who never planned to be anyone's father. But time has a strange way of healing the unwilling. Eli McCall was still rough around the edges, still grumbled more than he spoke, still checked the locks twice before bed and kept his rifle beside the door. But his hands, once used only for work and war, had learned the rhythm of comfort, steady, patient, strong. The land behind the new cabin had grown into a proper homestead. The townsfolk from Hollister's Gap pitched in, some brought lumber, others tools or seed. Sheriff Kane even showed up one weekend with a dozen chicks and a crooked grin. "You taken 3 kids," he said. "You're gonna need eggs." The coop was Sadie's responsibility now. She tended the hens like they were her own children, patient and watchful. Ben handled the garden quiet but focused, and Timmy, bright-eyed and talkative, made it his duty to follow Eli around asking questions until bedtime. "How do you know if someone's dangerous? What happens if you shoot a snake and miss? Do you think Mabel's sorry now?" Eli never lied. "I don't know," he said once, strings to by the fire. "Some folks get so deep in their pain they forget what sorry even means." By midsummer, the 3 children had taken Ellie's name, not legally, not yet, but in the way that mattered. They called him Pa, not loudly, not in public, but in the kitchen, or in the quiet just before dawn, or when Timmy woke from a nightmare and needed someone to say the darkness wouldn't win this time. Eli said it every time, and he meant it. One Sunday afternoon, a letter came. By courier, official seal, federal ink. Eli opened it slowly, sitting on the porch while the kids played by the creek. The letter was from Langford, short, polished. "This is your one warning. Stop asking questions. Stop stirring dust, or you'll regret what gets unearthed next." Lily burned the letter in the stove that night. Then he made 3 copies of the Ridge Ledger, each hidden in different places across the county. They could erase files, they could erase him, but they wouldn't erase the truth. A few weeks later, a stranger came to town. This one didn't wear polished boots or carry veiled threats. She was a tall, lean woman in a faded riding coat, with a scar along her left cheek and the kind of eyes that had seen the worst parts of men and lived through them. She introduced herself to the sheriff first, then the schoolhouse teacher, then, finally, to Eli. "Name's Nora Quinn," she said. "Gideon Ross was my brother." Eli stiffened. She gave him a small smile. "I know what happened. I read what you wrote down. You did right by him. I just needed to see for myself that someone had." Eli nodded. "I'm sorry," she nodded back. "He was a good man. You're the reason people know that now." Nora didn't stay long, but before she left, she handed Eli a folded envelope. Inside were deeds, small parcels of land, spread across 3 counties. "My brother had holdings," she said. "Didn't tell many people, but it's yours now, for what you did, for the kids." Eli tried to protest, but she cut him off. "Build something better with it," she said, "or bury the next bastard who thinks pain is a weapon." And with that, she rode off into the sunset. By fall, Eli had done something he never imagined, enrolled the children in the town school. Sadie tested high for her age, then was still shy but gifted in numbers, and Timmy, wild, relentless Timmy, had a knack for stories. The boy once whispered to Eli, "Maybe I'll write it all down someday." Eli smiled. "You should. Just make sure you tell the whole truth." Timmy looked up. "Even the part where I cried when Mabel locked you up." "Especially that part," Eli said, "because that's when you were braver than me." One cold morning near winter, Eli stood on the porch, coffee steaming in his hand, snow dusted. The fields, the wind carried a sharp edge. The sky was cloudless. He watched as Sadie hung laundry, Ben split kindling, and Timmy stomped after a runaway chicken with a stick in hand. They were loud, messy, unpredictable. They were his. And for the first time in years, the silence inside him had lifted. He wasn't just a man running from war anymore. He wasn't just the last survivor of a nightmare. He was the beginning of something good.